The air on Saipan is thick and heavy. It is the deep, silent hour before dawn on July 7, 1944. A light, warm rain patters on the broad leaves of elephant grass and drips from the shattered trunks of coconut trees. The smell is a pervasive mix of wet earth, cordite, and the faint, sickly sweet odor of death that no soldier ever forgets. Along the American lines, men of the 27th Infantry Division try to rest in their foxholes. Their world is a narrow trench of mud. They are exhausted. For 3 weeks they have fought for every yard of this jagged coral rock. The front, for now, is quiet. Only the buzzing of flies and the distant, rhythmic crash of the Pacific surf break the stillness. Then a new sound cuts through the gloom. It starts as a low murmur, a collective intake of breath from thousands of throats. It grows, swelling into a chaotic, dissonant chorus. Shouts, screams, the clatter of equipment. The sound is not one of disciplined attack, but of something raw, primal, and desperate. It rolls toward the American lines like a wave. In 100 foxholes, weary men snap to attention. Their hearts hammer against their ribs. They peer into the oppressive darkness, knowing what is coming. They grip their rifles, their Thompson submachine guns, and they listen for the one sound that can answer this onrushing storm: the relentless, mechanical bark of the machine gun. This opening salvo of sound and fury was the culmination of a brutal campaign that had begun weeks earlier, a critical operation born from the highest levels of Allied strategy. To understand the sheer scale of this final, desperate act, we must first journey back to the war rooms where the invasion of Saipan was conceived. The Mariana Islands arc across the western Pacific, a chain of volcanic peaks jutting from the deep ocean floor. In 1944, they were not just pieces of land, they were the outer ramparts of the Japanese Empire's inner defense zone. For American strategists, their capture was the key to unlocking the next phase of the war. The architect of this Pacific drive, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, saw the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam as a dual-purpose prize. First, their airfields would place the new long-range B-29 superfortress within striking distance of the Japanese home islands, threat that could burn the very heart of the enemy's war industry. Second, their capture would sever the Japanese supply lines to their scattered garrisons in the South Pacific, and critically provide a deep-water anchorage for the U.S. fleet at Tanapag Harbor on Saipan. The operation was codenamed Forager. It was the most ambitious amphibious assault yet launched in the Central Pacific. The island of Saipan itself was a defender's nightmare and an attacker's challenge. 20 miles long and 5 miles wide, it was a jagged landscape of limestone ridges, tangled sugarcane fields, and dense jungle. Mount Tapachau, a 1,554-foot peak at its center, dominated the interior, offering observers a panoramic view of the entire island. The Japanese had occupied the island since 1914 and had fortified it with a tenacity born of desperation. Coastal guns were embedded in caves, pillboxes dotted the beaches, and the interior was a maze of prepared positions, all manned by the 31st Army under the command of Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito. Saito, a cavalry officer of the old school, knew his mission was not to win, but to delay, to bleed the Americans white, to make the cost of taking Saipan so high that the American public would lose its stomach for the war. His force was a mixed bag: the battle-hardened 43rd Division, the 47th Independent Mixed Brigade, and a collection of naval garrison troops under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the disgraced commander of the carrier force at Pearl Harbor. In total, over 30,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors awaited the invasion. They did not wait long. On the morning of June 15, 1944, the sea off Saipan's western coast turned black with ships. It was an awesome, terrifying spectacle of American industrial might, a vast armada of over 600 vessels, from troop transports to massive battleships, stood offshore. At 05:42, the naval bombardment began, a thunderous overture that shook the very island. Shells from battleships and cruisers tore apart the coastline sending plumes of smoke and debris thousands of feet into the air. Then the landing craft, the squat, boxy LVTs, churned towards the beaches. The first waves of the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions hit the shores around Charan Canoa. They expected the bombardment to have silenced the defenders. They were wrong, as the LVTs ground onto the sand and coral. Hidden Japanese guns opened up, mortar rounds and artillery shells walked across the beaches, machine gun fire from well concealed. Pillboxes scythed through the advancing Marines. The water ran red. It was a scene of pure chaos and carnage. By nightfall, the Marines had established a tenuous, shallow beachhead, but they had suffered over 2,000 casualties. The battle for Saipan would not be a swift conquest. It would be a brutal, yard-by-yard grind into hell. The fight for the beachhead was only the beginning. The real battle for Saipan would be decided in the rugged interior, where the American advance would be measured in blood and yards, and where the Japanese defenders would be pushed to the very brink of annihilation. The American foothold was precarious, but it was firm. The next phase of the battle would see the beachhead expand, driving the Japanese into the island's unforgiving highlands and setting the conditions for a final, desperate confrontation. The days following the landing were a relentless, grinding push inland. The Marines, reinforced by the Army's 27th Infantry Division, fought their way off the bloody beaches and into a landscape that seemed designed to kill them. They advanced through sweltering sugarcane fields where every row could conceal a sniper or a spider hole. They climbed sheer, jagged limestone cliffs, exposed to mortar and machine gun fire. From above, the Japanese did not give ground. They had to be dug out of it, cave by cave, pillbox by pillbox. General Saito's defense was a masterclass in tenacious, prepared positional warfare. His men were deeply entrenched in the island's natural fortifications, a network of caves, ravines, and coral ridges known as the Death Valley and Purple Heart Ridge areas. American tanks were knocked out by well-sighted anti-tank guns. Infantry patrols were ambushed from hidden flanking positions. The cost was staggering for the American soldier and Marine. Saipan became a nightmare of constant vigilance and attrition. But while the infantry bled on the ground, a larger, more decisive battle was unfolding. At sea, the Japanese Imperial Navy, recognizing the catastrophic strategic implications of losing the Marianas, had committed its last great carrier force, the Mobile Fleet under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa. The American Fifth Fleet, under the command of Admiral Raymond Spruance, was waiting for them. The resulting engagement, fought on June 1920, 1944, would be known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese plan was elegant in theory, used their longer-range aircraft to strike the American fleet while their own carriers remained out of range. In practice, it was a disaster. American radar picked up the incoming raids while they were still miles away. The combat air patrols of F-6F Hellcats, flown by veteran pilots, tore into the inexperienced Japanese aviators. The sky was filled with the trails of falling aircraft. American sailors watched the spectacle, dubbing it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In 2 days, the Japanese lost over 600 aircraft and 3 carriers, including the new flagship the Tahoe, sunk by the submarine USS Albacore. It was a blow from which Japanese naval aviation would never recover. The news of this staggering naval defeat filtered back to General Saito on Saipan. It severed his last, thin hope of reinforcement or resupply. He and his army were now truly alone, abandoned on an island that was rapidly shrinking around them. The American noose was tightening. By the end of June, U.S. forces had captured the key airfield at Islito and the high ground of Mount Tapachau. They had driven a wedge across the island, splitting the Japanese forces. Sato's command post was constantly on the move. Forced into a cramped cave in a narrow valley near Makunsha, his troops were exhausted, starving, and low on ammunition. The wounded lay in the open, their cries echoing through the caves. The stench of decay was everywhere. On July 1, Saito issued a final, grim order. his forces would retreat to the northern part of the island and make a final stand. They would defend every position to the last man. But as the days passed and the American artillery and naval gunfire grew more intense, it became clear that even a protracted defense was futile. The end was inevitable. It was. In this atmosphere of utter hopelessness, surrounded by the ruins of his command and the suffering of his men, that a different, more ancient plan began to take shape. Sato's mind, not a defense but a final, glorious attack, a charge. This decision, born from the ashes of conventional defeat, would transform the final act of the Saipan campaign from a military conclusion into a cultural and human cataclysm. It would pit the soul of the samurai against the cold, hard steel of American industrial warfare. The stage was now set for the final, tragic act. The Japanese command, cornered and with no hope of victory, made a conscious choice to embrace a warrior's death. To understand the forces that would collide on the night of July 6th, we must examine the multiple converging angles that define this battle. For the average Japanese soldier on Saipan by July 6th, the world had shrunk to a small, desperate circle of suffering. He was no longer part of a cohesive army, but a member of a starving, battered remnant. His uniform was in tatters. His stomach ached with constant, gnawing hunger, subsisting on whatever scraps of canned crab or rotten rice could be scavenged. Dysentery was rampant. Water was a precious commodity, often drained from the radiators of wrecked vehicles. The constant, earth-shaking bombardment from American ships and artillery had frayed his nerves to a breaking point. He had watched his friends dismembered by shell blasts, his officers picked off by snipers. The initial fervor of patriotic duty had been replaced by a dull, grinding exhaustion and the certain knowledge of his own mortality. And then came the order. It was not an order for a tactical counterattack, but for Gyokusai. The word translates as the shattered jewel, a concept drawn from an ancient Chinese text, the Book of Northern Qi. It is better to be a shattered jewel than an unbroken tile. In the context of Imperial Japan's wartime ideology, it meant a glorious, suicidal charge to die for the emperor, preserving honor through self-annihilation. For some, it was a release, a final, cathartic end to the unbearable tension. For others, it was a terrifying sentence, but the cultural and military pressure was immense. To refuse was unthinkable. It would bring eternal shame upon their families. They were given a final meal sake, and what little food remained, they tied rags around their feet, fixed bayonets to their Arisaka rifles, and prepared to transform themselves from soldiers into a single, human projectile aimed at the American lines. Across the line, the American GI of the 27th Infantry Division was also tired, dirty, and scared, but his reality was fundamentally different. He was part of a machine that, while brutal, was designed to preserve his life through the application of overwhelming force. His world was his foxhole, his fire team, and the interlocking fields of fire that defined his company's perimeter. He had spent the last days digging, reinforcing, and registering his mortars and artillery on likely avenues of approach. He had ample ammunition, clean water, and a steady, if unappetizing, supply of care rations. Resupply and medical evacuation were a reality. His doctrine was one of defense in depth. His training emphasized controlled, aimed fire and the supremacy of the machine gun as the backbone of the infantry. He knew the Japanese were desperate, and he expected a night attack. The tension was a palpable thing. He would have spent the evening of July 6 checking and rechecking his M1 Garand rifle, ensuring his bandoliers of clips were full, and stacking grenades at the lip of his foxhole. He listened to the strange sounds drifting from the Japanese lines, the shouting, the singing, and knew what it meant. His fear was not of defeat, but of being overrun. His confidence rested not on individual martial spirit, but on the coordinated mechanical killing power of the weapons at his disposal. He was the crewman in a vast, lethal engine, waiting for the trigger to be pulled. At the heart of that engine was the Browning M1919 A4.30, caliber medium machine gun. It was not a new weapon, but it was a supremely effective one, weighing 31 pounds without its tripod. It was a brutally simple piece of machinery, a receiver, barrel and a bolt, all cooled by air. Its operation was a model of reliability. It fired the .3006 Springfield cartridge from a 250-round fabric belt at a cyclic rate of 400-500 rounds per minute. Its sound was not the high-pitched ripping of the German MG-42, but a slower, deeper, and authoritative bap, a relentless hammering bark that could be heard for miles. In a defensive perimeter, the Brownings were the anchors. They were sighted to provide interlocking, grazing fire, their bullets skimming just inches above the ground, creating a deadly wall of lead that no infantry charge could survive. A two-man team, a gunner and a loader, could maintain this fire for hours. The barrel would glow cherry red in the darkness, the air around it shimmering with heat. To the gunner, the weapon became an extension of his will. To the charging enemy, it was the voice of impersonal, industrial death. On Saipan, positioned on the low hills overlooking the valley, these machine guns would be the primary instrument of the coming slaughter, their steady, rhythmic fire providing the starkest possible answer to the chaotic screams of the human wave. These two armies, one driven by a code of honor and sacrifice, the other by a doctrine of firepower and survival, were now on a collision course. The final catalyst for the explosion would come from the minds of their leaders, whose decisions in these final hours would seal the fate of thousands. In his cramped, dark cave near Makansha, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito was a man utterly broken by the reality of modern warfare. He was ill, possibly wounded, and sustained by morphine. The news of the Navy's catastrophic defeat had severed his last link to the outside world. His command was disintegrating, the reports flowing in spoke of units annihilated, positions overrun, and a complete collapse of organized resistance. The American tactic of using flamethrowers and explosives to seal cave entrances was systematically exterminating his remaining forces. On July 5th, he held a final council of war with his staff and Admiral Nagumo. The decision made was not one of military logic, but of cultural and political necessity. Final static defense would only lead to their slow, inglorious extermination. Saito issued his last order: we will advance to attack the American forces. We will all die for the Emperor. I will never leave you behind. The plan was simple and born of a samurai's soul, not a general's mind. The remaining able-bodied men, perhaps 3,000, would form the core of the charge. They would be joined by every walking wounded soldier, every clerk, every cook, and every mechanic who could hold a rifle or a stick. They would infiltrate through the American lines under cover of darkness, mass for a surprise attack, and break through to the American supply dumps at Charan-Kanoa. There they would destroy the enemy planes and supplies. It was a fantasy, but its goal was not victory. Its goal was Jyo-kusai. In stark contrast, the American command, led by Lieutenant General Holland Howland Mad Smith, was a model of aggressive, systematic warfare. Smith was a Marine, impatient and driven, and he had little tolerance for what he perceived as the cautious pace of the Army's 27th Infantry Division. His strategy was one of relentless pressure, using superior firepower and mobility to compress the enemy into a kill zone. He was not thinking in terms of honor or final charges. He was thinking in terms of artillery, concentrations, unit boundaries, and logistical schedules. He knew the Japanese were cornered and he expected a violent reaction, but he trusted in the layered defenses his men had prepared. The leadership on Saipan presented a perfect dichotomy: one side seeking a glorious death, the other engineering a methodical kill. This clash of leadership was a microcosm of the vast cultural chasm that defined the Pacific War. The Japanese charge was the ultimate expression of Bushido as interpreted by the Imperial Japanese Army, a code that held capture as the ultimate dishonor and death in battle as the highest form of service to the divine emperor. surrender was not an option. This spiritual imperative often confounded the Western mind, which prioritized self-preservation and the belief that a living soldier could fight another day. For the Japanese on Saipan, there would be no other day. Their charge was a ritual, collective seppuku for the entire garrison. The American response was the product of a different culture entirely, one of industry, pragmatism, and mass production. The U.S. did not send its soldiers into battle with the expectation of a glorious death. It equipped them with the tools to kill the enemy as efficiently as possible from the greatest possible distance: the machine gun, the artillery, barrage, the flamethrower. These were the products of American factories and a military doctrine that valued victory through material superiority and the conservation of human life, at least on its own side. The relentless bark of the Browning was the sound of this philosophy made manifest. It was not an individual warrior's cry, but the voice of the assembly line, the steel mill, and the oil field. It was the sound of a nation's entire industrial might condensed into a single, terrifying, and mechanical rhythm. With these opposing forces, of spirit versus steel, of fatalism versus pragmatism, poised for collision, the island itself seemed to hold its breath. The final, terrifying catalyst would be the order to advance, transforming thousands of individuals into a single screaming wave of humanity, destined to break against a wall of fire. The plans were set, the weapons were prepared, the motivations, both desperate and dutiful, were locked in place. All that remained was the signal to begin the final catastrophic charge. The signal was a pistol shot. At approximately 04:30 on the morning of July 7, 1944, Lieutenant General Saito, too weak to join the charge, performed his final duty, seated in the traditional manner. Outside his cave, he committed seppuku, his adjutant delivering the decapitating stroke with his sword. Shortly after, Admiral Nagumo, the architect of Pearl Harbor, took his own life with a pistol. With their commanders gone, the final order was enacted. The assembly of the Japanese force was a scene from a fevered nightmare. From the hills and caves of the Makunsha Valley they emerged, not a neat military column, but a shambling, chaotic horde. At its core were the last disciplined soldiers of the 136th Infantry Regiment and the 9th Tank Regiment, a handful of Type 97 Kaiha tanks, their diesel engines coughing to life. But they were the minority. The bulk of the force was a terrifying spectacle of desperation, men with bandaged heads and arms in slings, hobbling on makeshift crutches, naval clerks armed with nothing but bayonets welded to long poles, engineers with shovels. Some carried only canteens, believing they would soon be drinking from American supplies. Many were drunk on the last of the sake ration, their voices raised in discordant songs and screams of Tenno Haika Banzai. Long live the emperors! They moved not with stealth, but with a deliberate roaring cacophony, as if the sound itself was a weapon. They streamed south, a human river flowing down the valley toward the American lines held by the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th Infantry Regiment and the 3rd Battalion of the 10th Marines, who were acting as infantry. The noise was their first herald, a swelling tide of shouts, screams, and the clatter of equipment that grew ever louder in the pre-dawn gloom. The first American outposts, listening to this approaching storm, radioed back frantic, disbelieving reports. They were not facing an attack, they were facing an avalanche. The initial wave hit the forward foxholes of the 105th Infantry. The American riflemen, peering into the half-light, saw a sight that defied all military logic: a wall of humanity, thousands strong, was rushing directly at them. They opened fire with their M1 Garand and Browning automatic rifles. Men in the front ranks of the charge fell, but were immediately trampled by the press of bodies behind them. The charge did not slow. It was a tsunami of flesh and blood, and it washed over the forward American positions. Minutes, foxholes were overrun. Isolated platoons were surrounded and destroyed. Brutal close-quarters fighting. The Japanese, infused with a final frenzied strength, used Bayonets, swords, and even their bare hands. It was not a battle of fire and maneuver. It was a primal, close-quarter slaughter. The thin American line began to buckle and bend. The center of the 1st Battalion, 105th Infantry, was pierced. A chaotic, violent melee swirled in the darkness, illuminated by the flashes of rifles, the explosions of grenades, and the burning wrecks of the few Japanese tanks that had managed to advance. The American command posts were suddenly on the front line. The situation was critical. The Banzai charge had achieved its first shocking objective. It had broken through, but breaking through was one thing. Surviving what came next was another. The initial shock had been absorbed, the forward positions sacrificed. Now, the deeper American defenses, anchored on the low hills and prepared killing zones, came alive. The real, systematic work of the machine guns was about to begin. The charge had achieved a terrifying, localized breakthrough, but in doing so it had funneled the entire surviving Japanese force into the jaws of a prearranged killing machine. The flexible American defense now contracted like a muscle, bringing its overwhelming firepower to bear on the penetrations. As the human wave surged past the overrun forward positions, it lost its cohesion. It was no longer a focused military force, but a desperate, sprawling mob, its momentum carrying it directly into the primary defensive belts of the 105th Infantry. Here, the American defense hardened into an unbreakable wall of steel. On the flanks, on slightly elevated ground, the machine gun crews of the U.S. Army had been waiting. They had listened to the rising tide of noise, the frantic small arms fire from their forward comrades, and the desperate radio traffic. Now, in the growing light of dawn, they saw their target. The valley was filled with a seething mass of enemy soldiers funneling into their fields of fire. The gunners took a deep breath, and then they began their work. The sound was not a continuous roar, but a disciplined, rhythmic, and terrifying BAP. BAP, BAP, BAP. It was the sound of controlled, aimed fire. The Browning M1919A4 machine guns, along with the heavier, water-cooled M1917s of the weapons companies, began firing in interlocking bands. Tracers, 1 in every 5 rounds, cut through the half-light, drawing brilliant red lines across the landscape. These lines converged, crisscrossing, creating a lattice of death. The gunners traversed their weapons back and forth methodically, like farmers scything wheat. They did not need to aim at individual men, they aimed into the crowd. The effect was catastrophic. The .3006 caliber rounds tore through human bodies with horrific efficiency. Men were literally blown apart. The charge disintegrated into a scene of unimaginable carnage. The front ranks were mowed down, their bodies piling up. Windrows, those behind, tripped and stumbled over the growing mounds of the dead, and dying only to be cut down themselves. The relentless bark of the machine guns was joined by the sharper cracks of rifles, the thump-thump-thump of 60 and 81 mortars dropping high-explosive shells into the packed ranks, and the direct fire from 37 anti-tank guns firing canister shot, each round a giant shotgun blast that cleared a bloody swath. The Japanese soldiers, driven by a fanatical fervor, continued to press forward. They charged directly into the machine gun fire, screaming their battle cries until the instant they were hit. Some made it to within yards of the American positions, only to be shredded by a final point-blank burst. Others, armed with satchel charges, attempted to throw themselves onto American gun pits, achieving a posthumous, Pyrrhic destruction. But for every gunner killed, another soldier would scramble forward to take his place, clearing a jam, feeding a new belt of ammunition, and continuing the fire. The fighting was fiercest around the command post of the 1st Battalion, 105th Infantry, which became a fortified island in the Japanese torrent. Here, clerks, cooks, and headquarters staff joined the line, firing carbines and M1s until their barrels grew hot. The battle devolved into 100 small, savage fights, but the outcome was never doubt. The American line, though bent and battered, did not break. The firepower was Simply too immense, too organized, and too relentless. By 0900, the main force of the charge had been annihilated. The momentum was gone. What had been a roaring, living wave was now a silent, sprawling field of the dead. Small, isolated groups of Japanese continued to launch futile, piecemeal attacks throughout the day, but these were merely the final, sputtering sparks of a fire that had already consumed itself. The great Banzai charge, the last samurai's cry, had been met and extinguished by the mechanical, impersonal efficiency of the machine gun. The roar of battle faded, replaced by an eerie, ringing silence, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the sporadic crackle of gunfire as GIs ensured the sprawling corpse. Field held no more threats. The sun climbed higher over Saipan, illuminating a landscape transformed by the night's violence and revealing the full, horrifying cost of the charge. The morning light revealed the staggering, gruesome aftermath of the night's violence. The charge was over, but the task of counting the cost and understanding the consequences had just begun. The morning of July 7, 1944, revealed a scene of almost biblical horror. In front of the lines of the 105th Infantry Regiment, the valley was a single, sprawling carpet of the dead. Bodies were piled 3 and 4 deep in places, a tangled, bloody mass of over 4,000 Japanese soldiers. The air, already thick with the humidity of the tropics, grew heavy with the coppery scent of blood and the first, sickly sweet hints of decomposition. Flies descended in black, buzzing clouds. American soldiers, hollow-eyed and numb with fatigue, moved cautiously through the carnage. Their task was grim: to secure the area, dispatch any lingering, armed enemy, and begin the process of identifying their own losses. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 105th had been mauled. In a single night of fighting, they had suffered over 650 men killed and wounded, a staggering casualty rate that testified to the ferocity of the close quarters combat before the machine guns had stabilized the line. Individual companies had been nearly wiped out. For the Japanese, the charge had been an act of near-total self-annihilation. The organized military force on Saipan had effectively ceased to exist. With the death of General Saito and Admiral Nagumo, all centralized command and control vanished. The few thousand soldiers who had not participated in the charge, along with a large number of Japanese civilians, were now trapped in the northernmost tip of the island, at Marpi Point. Here, the tragedy of Saipan deepened into an even darker chapter. Propaganda from the Japanese military had convinced many civilians that the Americans were barbarians who would torture, rape, and murder them upon capture. Driven by this fear and a cultural imperative to avoid the shame of capture, hundreds of families committed mass suicide. Parents threw their children from the high cliffs at Marpi Point onto the jagged rocks below before leaping to their own deaths. Others waded into the sea to drown. American troops arriving at the scene, using loudspeakers and Japanese American interpreters, pleaded with them to stop, to surrender, that they would be safe. Many were simply unable to comprehend this horror. These were not soldiers making a choice, it was the systematic destruction of a civilian population by its own leaders. Ideology. The suicides at Marpi Point remain one of the most haunting and tragic images of the entire Pacific War. The fall of Saipan was now inevitable. On July 9, 1944, Admiral Turner declared the island officially secured. The cost had been immense. The American forces suffered over 13,000 casualties, including 3,000 killed. The Japanese garrison was virtually erased. Of the estimated 30,000 defenders, only a few hundred were taken prisoner. The rest lay dead across the island, but the strategic implications of this victory extended far beyond the body count on this single, bloody island. The fall of Saipan sent shockwaves that would ripple all the way to the halls of power in Tokyo and Washington, D.C., permanently altering the strategic calculus of the war. The capture of Saipan was a tactical victory of the highest order, but its true impact was strategic and psychological, delivering a blow to the Japanese empire from which it could not recover. In Tokyo, the news of Saipan's loss was a political earthquake. For the first time in the war, an island considered part of Japan's inner defense perimeter had been captured. The strategic consequences were immediate and dire, with Saipan's airfields in American hands. The home islands were now within the operational radius of the new B-29 superfortress, the industrial cities of Japan, which had believed themselves immune from strategic bombing, were now vulnerable. The war had been brought to Japan's doorstep. The political fallout was swift and severe. On July 18, 1944, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and his entire cabinet were forced to resign. Tojo, the face of Japanese militarism, had staked his reputation on the defense of the Marianas. Their loss was a clear admission of his government's failure. The Tojo cabinet was replaced by a new government under General Kuniaki Koiso, but the damage to the prestige of the military leadership was irreparable. The myth of Japanese invincibility, already frayed, had been shattered. The inner circles of the Japanese government began to privately understand that total victory was now impossible, though public rhetoric remained defiant. The path forward shifted from one of seeking victory to one of hoping for a negotiated peace, or of making the cost of invasion so high that the Americans would settle for terms. For the United States, Saipan was a validation of the entire Central Pacific Drive. The island-hopping strategy, championed by Admiral Nimitz, had proven its worth, delivering a knockout blow to Japanese naval air power and providing an unsinkable aircraft carrier for the strategic bombing campaign. Almost immediately, U.S. Navy Seabees began a massive expansion of the airfields on Saipan and on Tinian, which was captured soon after. The runways were lengthened and strengthened to handle the massive B-29s. By November 1944, the first B-29s arrived. On November 24, a B-29 named Dauntless Dottie lifted off from Eiley Field on Saipan for the first firebombing raid on Tokyo. The aerial siege of Japan had begun, a campaign of destruction that would culminate 10 months later with the atomic bombs dropped from Tinian. Psychologically, the battle cemented a grim reality for the American soldier and Marine. Fighting the Japanese, the fanatical resistance, and the mass suicide at Marpy Point erased any lingering notions that the enemy could be induced to surrender through conventional means. It reinforced a hardening attitude on the front lines. This was a war of extermination fought against an enemy that would not or could not quit. The relentless, brutal nature of the fighting on Saipan, culminating in the Great Banzai charge, set a terrifying precedent for the battles to come at Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The American military now understood with chilling clarity that the final invasion of the Japanese home islands would demand a price in blood beyond all previous imagination. The machine guns had fallen silent on the field, but their echo would shape the final terrible year of the war, influencing strategy, politics, and the very soul of the nations. Locked in a fight to the finish. The guns are cold, the bodies have been buried, the strategic calculations have been made, yet the event demands a final, sober contemplation, a look beyond the tactics. And the body counts to its enduring meaning. The field before the 105th Infantry Regiment is quiet now. The relentless bark of the machine guns exists only as a memory, a ghost in the ears of those who survived. The shattered jewel lies in countless pieces, scattered across a sun-scorched valley. The unbroken tile of the American line held, but it was scarred, chipped, and forever altered by the impact. The last samurai charge on Saipan stands as a stark monument in the history of warfare. It was not merely a battle, but a collision of epics. On one side, a martial spirit forged in the age of the katana, valuing honor, face, and the glory of a single, decisive moment. On the other, the cold, relentless logic of the industrial age, where victory was measured in production quotas, firepower, and the systematic application of force. The charge was the final, brilliant, and terrible flash of a dying way of war, extinguished not by a greater spirit, but by the indifferent mechanics of the machine gun. In the end, the story of Saipan is a human tragedy of incomprehensible scale. It is a story of soldiers on both sides pushed beyond the limits of endurance, of leaders making impossible choices in the face of annihilation, and of civilians caught in a cataclysm they could not control. The charge was a failure in every military sense, but it succeeded in searing itself into the consciousness of a generation, a brutal lesson in what happens when ancient codes meet modern firepower. The echoes of those gunshots on Saipan did not fade with the war, they reverberate through history, a somber reminder of the cost when cultural absolutism meets industrial might, and of the terrifying, often tragic, shapes that human courage can take. When there are no good choices left, it is a lesson written not in ink but in coral and blood.